And of course, we've read the story before. It didn't quite play out as
Nope.
intended
Nope.
because that apple's still there.
Apple incident.
We'll see a little bit about that, and
Yep.
that affects us even today. But by God's grace, He still comes through with His promise, His covenantal promises that we see played out in His generosity. Well, I'm excited for you all to see this and to glean from it. We hope you enjoy it. We also would love to hear back from you, what your feedback is or how this is impacting you. So here we go.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Redeeming Why We Give. I'm Heather Roughton, and I am just thankful that you are joining us again as we continue our journey into reframing giving in the context of God's creative mission. Today, we're going to be in Module 3. Now, talking about Module 2 last week, we discussed a lot of information. We discussed their why, their what, and their how. And wow, their how is complicated. I hope the way it was presented gave you an opportunity to really reflect and contemplate on why giving was such a complex part of their community, of their faith, of their culture. And today the purpose is diving into Module 3. You see, the people in the Old Testament had the formula, but then something went wrong. What went wrong? That's what we're going to talk about today. Let's dive in. Hi, everybody, and we are jumping into Module 3. Today, we're going to be recollecting giving in the Old Testament, what went wrong. And next week, we'll be in Module 4, reframing giving in the New Testament. Last week, we talked about Module 2, recollecting giving in the Old Testament. And so Module 3 is really a continuation of Module 2 so that we can dive in a little bit further to what went wrong. They had the formula. So what happened? So we're going to do a quick review and then we're going to dive into our content. So recollecting giving in the Old Testament, why did they give? So I want to remind you, look back at Module 2 for detail on this, but at the root of everything was creation. And nature and animals had their order. They seemed to know exactly what to do. Humans were created with an order, except we were a little bit different. We were made in God's image, typified by this disco globe with all the mirrors, and of course the apple incident ever above the heads of the humans here. Creation kind of takes a dynamic of its own in that. But what was unique about their why was the distinction between created and creator. So they understood that difference. So in other words, they understood that all of creation existed because of the creator. Without the creator, nothing would be here. And so there seemed to be this initial sense of this creator, God, deserves honor, deserves gratitude simply for us existing in the first place. So the difference between created and creator was critical to their understanding of why they gave. They realized their complete existence relied upon the creator. Father Rob Griffith often talks and about this and says this in many sermons. God is God and we are not. And that is, I think, a great summation of their why with their understanding of the creator and the created. And the created exists simply because the creator made it so. And so our existence relies upon that creator. Now, let's review what they gave. So, remembering this reciprocal relationship that we talked about in Module 2, the Creator offers the heartbeat, the love of God to creation, so that creation would fulfill its purpose that was designed by the Creator. Specifically, humans with this disco globe are to respond to God with their offerings. So giving was rooted in this reciprocal relationship. And there was a give and take in this reciprocal relationship, and there is. God provides life. Their response was their first and best. They gave of their first and best. Then God declares what is right and good. Humans respond with choosing to be obedient and live in the safety of the pathway of God. And then God's wisdom. God knows what humans need to live a full and healthy life. And so humans' response is this work and growth, practicing God's plan for full and healthy living. And then how did they give? And this is where things get a little complicated. So, quick review. God on earth wants to be with humans. So the tabernacle is something where God and humans could meet together. And God gave the heart of this mission to the priests, the leadership of this temple. And they would perform different rituals in order to respond to God and honor God on behalf of humans. And big part of their purpose was reflecting and representing God in creation. And so imagine the Garden of Eden, and before the apple incident, God and humans could be together and walk together in the evening in the garden. That is early in Genesis. Well, after the apple incident, things changed, and there was a bit of a separation between God and humans. And God, desiring to be a relationship with humans, says, here, let's put this tabernacle in place, and then there will be leadership, the priests, to make sure that everything runs according to God's design. Now, there was this understanding of these rituals. We talked about this in Module 2. Go back for more detail, but here's a high-level view. The priests would oversee sacrificial offerings, which were intended to maintain and restore the relationship between people and God. And then there were the festivals and feasts. These are genuine parties to celebrate their relationship with God, and gratitude, remembrance, and remembering their promises to God. And then the covenants, though not a ritual in action, they were central to their understanding of the terms of the relationship that they had with God. And each of these would be a genuine response regarding that reciprocal relationship with God. So, given that quick review, we're going to look at why did they give. They were grateful for the gift of life and sustenance and a reciprocal relationship between them and God. And what did they give? They offered their first and their best. And the why eclipsed the what. How did they give? That structure of tabernacle, temple, and priests created the opportunity for humans to give. Yet, something was off. And this is where we're going to dive into the what went wrong. So, just kind of reminding ourselves about this reciprocal relationship between God and humans. Giving is designed to be relational. It is designed to function in this reciprocal relationship with God, where God is offering provision, sustaining and giving life, giving direction on what is right and good, giving wisdom on how to live a full and healthy life as humans. And humans' responses were to be their first and best, obedience and safety, and their work and growth. This is what rooted their giving in the Old Testament. Now, it was designed to be relational, but unfortunately, it became more about rules. So here, as a reminder, God's heart is to bring order from disorder. And he blessed humans to bring order from disorder in creation itself. But what happened over time is became a focus on rules in order to maintain order. So here is a visual of what I call human sin management. And what the goal was here was to manage our sin based on the rules, the how of their giving, which would be the sacrificial offerings, festivals, and feasts, right? That was their kind of boots on the ground understanding. And so what happened is a hyper focus on the rules created a process that negated the heartbeat of God, which was the relationship with God. So I'm going to walk you through this. So God says, I want humans to bring order from disorder. So here's disorder. The vision was, here's these rules. If you follow these rules, then there will be order. Inevitably, apart from the heartbeat of God, that order would break down and they would institute more rules, which then would inevitably cause someone to not follow the rules and create disorder, and then the cycle would continue over and over again. So this is a good visual of human sin management, and frankly, it's exhausting. We all know what it's like for simply more rules to be given and applied in order to maintain order. It simply doesn't work. Humans don't work that way, particularly the human heart. And so what we find here is that these rules, apart from the heart of God, is a cycle that is exhausting and never ending and can feel overwhelming. So this causes this breakdown between God and humans in this reciprocal relationship. And what happens is essentially humans turn towards a human sin management process that was apart from the reciprocal relationship that was designed from the beginning. God's intent to be in that beautiful reciprocal relationship of give and take between creator and created. Well, now humans are more interested in following the rules and less interested in giving back to God this disco globe where they reflect and represent God in creation. Now the focus is on rules. So there were these prophets, and I'm going to hide the camera so that you can see this fully. So there were some folks who I call the truth tellers and disruptors. This is the prophets. And the prophets are later in the Old Testament. And we don't often spend a lot of time talking about the prophets. They're certainly in the readings during church. But I want to dive into kind of describing what each of these truth tellers and disruptors had to say regarding this broken formula. So Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Micah, and Malachi. These are some primary prophets, major prophets, and minor prophets. And I want to take a moment to explain the difference between major prophets and minor prophets. It doesn't mean anyone is better or than the other. It just simply means their books are a little bit smaller. So major prophets, the books are bigger, and minor prophets, their books are smaller. So Isaiah had something to say about this broken formula. He said rituals mean nothing apart from genuine integrity and justice. And then Jeremiah says God wants you to truly love and follow him, care for the needy, and not just perform rituals. So his focus was realizing, hey, you guys, this human sin management process has totally separated you from the natural reciprocal relationship that you're supposed to have with God. And when you have that loving reciprocal relationship with God, you are able to do the thing God cares about, which is to care for the needy and not just perform rituals for the sake of sin management. Ezekiel, his declaration was turn around, literally telling them to stop the direction you're going and go back, to come back to a sincere relationship with God, devoted, showing mercy, and caring for the needy. Sounds a lot like Jeremiah. Then Micah. Micah is a minor prophet, and he writes, God desires your heart. And that again focuses on the heart of that reciprocal relationship, not your empty rituals. God wants you to care for the needy, give mercy, and live humbly. Do you see a pattern there? That they're reminding Israel that the purpose of this reciprocal relationship was for them to live out their purpose as reflecting the image of God into the world and in creation and representing God. And then finally, Malachi, he says, stop your half-hearted worship. Bring your whole heart to God. Give generously and live in justice. So what Malachi is saying is this broken formula is not what God intended. And when you do this and you focus on human sin management, which includes sacrificial offerings, the festivals and the feasts, and even perhaps the covenants, that it wasn't bringing your whole heart to God. You're more focused on the how, the rules, rather than focusing on the why. Because the why is what drives the what and the how. And this is what the prophets were saying they'd forgotten about. Now, what was fascinating is there became a surprising new direction from the same prophets that were really kind of unhappy with Israel and the decisions they were making. They were using this process of human sin management rather than living into the reciprocal relationship with God, where they could do exactly what they were purposed to do, which is reflect the love of God into the world and represent God. There came this new surprising direction from those very same prophets. And the addition is Hosea. So there's a new vision that is given. Now, I'm going to be able to come back on camera now, and I want to talk about each one of these. So Hosea. So Hosea is a minor prophet. And again, it's just because his book is smaller. But he writes about a new deep connection between God and his people, like a fresh start. And then Ezekiel talks about a spiritual renewal and a fresh relationship with God, transforming the heart and spirit so that there would be a return to this relationship with God, that there would be a way given that would take them away from the human sin management back to that relationship with God. Jeremiah is given a vision about a deep inner change and forgiveness that leads to a closer, more personal relationship with God. And then Isaiah, now he writes about a new thing that is coming. God's blessings and salvation will be even greater, giving renewal and hope to everyone. And so what we're seeing in balance is there's this part of the prophets that are saying to Israel, turn around, come back to God, come back to the heart and relationship of God. What you're doing is too focused on the how, and you need to get back to your why. And then there's this other part of the prophets where God is giving them a clear vision that God is saying, I'm going to do something new. Something else is coming, and there's going to be a restoration of relationship with God, that there is going to be a renewal of the heart, of the spirit. And that is definitely hopeful. Now, at this point, after the prophet Malachi, there's a period of radio silence. For 400 years, God does not speak to Israel. And we call that the silent period. I like to call it radio silence because it makes sense, right? The radio just goes silent for 400 years. Now, in this 400-year period, there are things that are happening. And so I think it's important to talk about that. So here's kind of an eye chart. And I'm going to start back at 538 BC, before the radio silence started. So in 538, they returned from exile. So Israel went into exile for a very long time, and they did not have a temple. They did not have anything. They were kind of nomads. And Cyrus the Great of the Persian Empire allows Israel to return and rebuild the temple. And in 516, that temple is completed. Now, in 430 BC, radio silence begins. So it's a pretty significant time between the completion of the Second Temple and the radio silence beginning. And the prophets at this time, that period, would have been pretty vocal regarding this human sin management situation. Now, around the time of Prophet Malachi, radio silence begins and God goes quiet. Now, in 300 BC, about 130 years or so, synagogues began to take more of a formal appearance. So in the exile, it makes sense that they didn't have a temple that they could go to and have community and connection and do their rituals, right? And so they would kind of create these kind of informal synagogues where they could get together for worship, for community and education. Well, in 300 BC, this became a more formal practice where synagogues started popping up in these small little areas, not focused on Jerusalem, but in these smaller towns where people could get together, and there would be a priest, and there would be someone to run the synagogue, and there would be a community opportunity and education, very similar to what we experience in the church today. Now, in 300 to 200 BC, there were a lot of writings going on. So there was the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures from Alexandria. And then, perhaps familiar, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which consisted of biblical manuscripts and different writings that were written from 250 to 50 CE, okay? So there was a lot of writings and a lot of things being documented. And I think it's important for us to remember that God has gone quiet, and yet there's a lot of activity. And then finally, in 100 BC, there is a development of various Jewish sects. So before this time, there was no different sects in Judaism. There was just Judaism, and this was the people of Israel. And in 100 BC, we start to see these different Jewish sects appearing: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. And a couple of those might sound familiar to you from the Gospels in the New Testament. Now, in 63 BCE, there is Roman control, and it certainly sets the stage for what we come to understand as the New Testament and the birth of Jesus Christ. So, as we resume our route, I want to remind you, let's look a big picture, 10,000-foot view of the giving in the Old Testament, and it started out great, okay? So it started out great because they were giving. Their why was grateful for the gift of life and sustenance and that reciprocal relationship with God. They gave. What did they give? They gave their first and best of labor, and the why eclipsed the what, and then their how. That structure of the temple and the tabernacle and the priesthood and the offerings and the festivals. So it started out great, but their why at the end of the, at the bottom line is they lost their why. Rules trumped their why. And their what? Well, their what turned into a disconnected what, where the logistics overruled the heart. They were giving their first and best, but they were perhaps more interested in the logistics of that versus the heart, that response to God to understand that God had provided. And so therefore this first and best was simply an honoring to say thank you. And then finally their how. Their how kind of turned into got too good at how. They really got very good at following those rules, which created that cycle of the human sin management cycle that was apart from the heartbeat of God. So they got too good at the how, and then perfection kind of trumped authenticity. God was interested in their hearts, not them following the rules to the best of their ability. Obedience was never about checking all the boxes. It was coming to God with an authentic, open heart, with a desire to work and to grow, which was one of their key responses to God's giving, was their belief that they needed to work and practice and grow in their spiritual formation. So in the big picture, this is what we see happening. At the end of the Old Testament, though, their why was trumped by rules, and their what was overruled by logistics, and their how was about perfection, following those rules, and often unfortunately creating more and more rules that God had never intended in the first place. So that's it for Module 3. Next week, we're going to be jumping into reframing giving in the New Testament. I am so grateful that you have joined us on this journey, and I look forward to seeing you in the next module. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.